Cinematic is a word that I think a ton of people toss around nowadays. And generally this is a very broad adjective to describe a lot of different things. And for me, I think people typically use the word cinematic, they're thinking about things in the cinema itself. So one of these traits when you go watch a movie is the giant aspect ratio, the super widescreen aspect ratio that you've seen in a ton of different movies. And for filmmakers, this image is traditionally produced with large anamorphic cine lenses requiring giant camera crews and giant support camera rigs. And that was all true until now. This is a Blazar Apex 50mm T1.8 Autofocus Anamorphic Lens. Now this is quite possibly the first autofocus anamorphic lens to hit the market. What's going on, guys? My name is Brian Cho. I'm a videographer and photographer based in Brooklyn, New York, and I've had the Blazar. I bought it with my own money for about over a month now. I've been holding off on doing a review because I don't know if you could tell, I'm pretty congested, just getting over a cold. Got back from Iceland using this Blazar anamorphic lens, and of course I was super excited to shoot in the beautiful Iceland landscape and bring back footage to you, but of course I had to take some time to recover from this illness. Now, if you watched my last video, I actually did a review on the Sirui autofocus anamorphic lens, which is also arguably in contention with the Blazar as being the first autofocus anamorphic lens to hit the market. And one major drawback about that lens, and a lot of complaints it's received, is that the image appeared too spherical, too perfect, too sterile. And Blazar being the other company to release a competing autofocus anamorphic lens, of course I had to try it out. Blazar is no newcomer to the optics or anamorphic lens space. They were formerly known as Greatjoy before they rebranded into Blazar, and they produce a lot of lenses that are fan favorites for the indie filmmaker scene. They produce the 2x Katos, the 1.5x Remus, have just released the 50mm T1.8 and the 35mm T1.8 Apex autofocus lenses, and just announced at NAB the 1.33x Mantis lenses meant for mirrorless cameras. So basically, they know what they're doing, and so people were really excited when they announced that they're going to implement some autofocus technology into their lenses. So just to cover some of the quick specs, this is a 1.33 times anamorphic lens, so it won't have the crazy squeeze of a 2 times or even like a 1.5 obviously, but the look that this thing produces seems more than 1.3, and I'll show some examples later when we talk about the image. As of today, this only comes in E-mount, and it's meant for Super 35 or crop sensor cameras. I did try to use it on my full frame, but I realized that the image circle is much smaller than the Sirui. Like the Sirui, the Blazar Apex is a full metal construction. It feels really hefty in the hand, but not too heavy. It's a pretty good size. It's got a 77mm filter thread. I don't think you can put on a clamp-on matte box into this. I don't really see space for it. It's got geared focus rings with hard stops. It's got a manual focus autofocus switch, which feels inverted in my opinion. It's got autofocus in the rear and manual focus switch in the front. It's got a declicked aperture ring. It's got a weather sealing gasket, amazing. And then it's got a USB-C input for updates. I also love how gaudy and like conspicuous this lens is. Like when I was taking this around in Iceland, everyone was just staring at this lens, wondering like what it could be. You know, most people don't carry around a similar lens when they're just, you know, going around for travel, but obviously with the color pattern on this, like this really stands out from like a mile away. I think it's really cool. So yeah, some of the drawbacks about this lens are that even with the hard stops, it still is acceleration based. So it's not actually going to be precise when you're turning the focus ring. It adjusts depending on how fast you turn it. And while the focus ring has gears, oddly enough, the aperture ring does not. And it's extremely easy to accidentally bump around. I think this is a little bit weird, you know, considering that the Sirui lens has gears on the aperture and focus ring. And the aperture ring is so close to the mount that I feel like if you do end up putting a cage or something on your camera, it's gonna be really hard to touch this aperture ring. And because there's no A functionality, like to talk about in my Sirui review, you can't control the aperture through your camera dial. You have to adjust it physically on the lens itself. I think this is a huge miss. I wish Blazar just included an automatic like red A to lock the aperture ring into. That way you don't have to constantly fiddle with the lens itself like its autofocus. It should be, you know, mindless for a lot of solo shooters, not have to touch the lens itself when they're shooting. Another great thing about the build of this thing is that I did reach out to Blazar and ask them if it was weather resistant, and they did say it was water resistant, but obviously not waterproof. But it felt waterproof to me because I don't baby my gear, and I took this lens with me and my Sony FX30 under a waterfall. The FX30 unfortunately had a temporary error signal because I had forgot to cover the hot shoe, but this lens was chugging along, and the weather sealing gasket on this is very prominent. Like there's definitely no moisture that's gonna leak into here. Now the major drawback with this lens, the Sirui anamorphic, was that a lot of people talked about how like sterile and kind of, you know, boring the image produced out of this thing is. It definitely didn't look bad, let me get that straight. I think people just expected a lot more distortions, some chromatic aberrations, typical of some anamorphic lenses. It just seemed like a spherical lens with, you know, cropped aspect ratio. So I think that was one downside that people talked about this lens, and it had some questionable, oddly shaped bokeh. So I would definitely say that if you're looking for something that has way more character, I would say the Blazar Apex produces an image much more typical of anamorphic lenses. You got beautiful waterfall bokeh in the background and out of focus areas. You got beautiful oval bokeh balls. The image is soft, but not too soft, which is typically what you want with some cinema lenses. You don't want too much digital sharpness. While the Sirui has much more of a clinical look, And I actually really like this for corporate shoots, but obviously if you're doing something more related to narrative work, then I would definitely pick up the Apex. So personally, I love the image of the Blazar over the Sirui, but again, like if I was doing paid corporate work, I would definitely stick with the Sirui itself. And then the Blazar is probably something a little bit more for narrative work or something stylistic. So let's talk about autofocus. So because I started off with the Sirui first and then the Blazar, I was actually disappointed initially with the Blazar's autofocus performance. The Sirui has very anxious autofocus motors, and so it constantly tries to actuate and pump and find that focal plane in the image. The problem with that is that the motors are incredibly loud for that reason. And there's like a little bit of a lack of control if you're in like really intense sequences where you're trying to capture focus in different planes. I figured this out by mainly lowering the autofocus tracking speed in my camera, and then it was a little bit better, especially with an update. And so if you're just doing talking heads or something controlled, the Sirui is perfect. And the autofocus is super twitchy, eye autofocus, face, everything. And then the Blazar, it seemed like it took its time to go from A to B. So it would slowly focus rack into the next subject that you're trying to focus onto. So for me, obviously, I'm like a little frustrated trying to get that focus quicker because I was so used to working with the Sirui. But over time, I actually ended up liking the Blazar's style of focus acquisition much better than the Sirui, because I would much rather have a controlled focus rack that's a little bit slower that eventually ends up on its subject. So it actually seemed like a very normal human focus rack, like I had an AC with a follow focus, versus the Sirui, which might be a little bit too quick and temperamental so that it keeps jumping back and forth and hunting. So I actually ended up liking the Blazar, even if it's a little bit slower. I'm interested to see where they take the autofocus performances of these two series of lenses, the Apex and the Sirui Autofocus Anamorphic, because with the USB-C input on both of these lenses, there's obviously a ton of opportunity to upgrade the firmware and change how the motors perform. I like how the Blazar acts right now. If they can improve that just a tiny bit, I think it'd be amazing. Sirui, I think they need to calm down the motors or develop new ones in their next series of autofocus lenses. So of course I'm already comparing the two lenses, but overall it's actually a little bit more difficult to pick between the two lenses. Obviously it sounds like I'm leaning much more toward the Blazar, but both lenses have their own positives and negatives. Like the one major thing about the image performance themselves about these two lenses is that the Blazar Apex performs well, but it's obviously optimized for Super 35 sensors. Like the image circle is very tiny, so if you try to shoot full frame for some reason, there's an incredible vignette. It just looks like a pinhole. While the Sirui, the image circle on this lens is actually quite huge. Like you have a little bit of vignetting, but if you magnify maybe 1.1 and 1.2 times, which you can achieve with active steady shot in Sony Alpha cameras, then you can get a full frame image from this lens. So you're getting a true 40mm full frame image out of this lens, while out of this 50mm Apex, you're shooting an equivalent 75 full frame. So to me, this flexibility is kind of invaluable, you know, to be able to punch in and out without having to constantly move back and forth. If you're a run and gun shooter, I think that's pretty invaluable. Obviously, this is very situational and personal. And for me, I just like the flexibility of being able to push in and out when I need to. I think the AF performs better when you're punched in on the Sirui, but you know, not being able to zoom out of this at 50mm at Super 35 is a little bit tough for me personally. So of course, if you're a run and gun shooter, in the end, like both these lenses work perfectly fine, especially if you know what you're doing. Like you can make it work with either of these lenses. I do believe the Siruis are a bit cheaper. I need to make sure I check that on the screen right now. While the Blazars are going for about $8.99, I believe, and they just released a 35mm, which I think is running for $79.9 US right now on their website if you want to grab that. So actually what I'm going to do is, although I preferred the image coming out of the Blazar, because I had no flexibility to at least zoom out a little bit of that 50mm crop image, I think I'm actually going to return this, keep the Sirui because this was gifted to me, and pick up the 35mm Apex because that is equivalent to a 50 full frame, and that's something a little bit more usable to me than kind of a punched in 75 or 70 image in full frame equivalent. I think it's just a little bit too tight for the kind of work I do. Like if I'm going to shoot with these, probably I need like a medium to medium wide frame, not something too punched in. I don't know how often I would pick up this specific lens. But obviously that's just my personal opinion. Like this lens works perfectly well, it's fine. It's totally up to you. From what I've seen online, like the Blazar seems incredibly popular at the moment. But I think their supply is a little bit lower than I would say from the Sirui. So if you wanted to pick up something used even, I think if you can go on B&H, you can find something with the Sirui for a little bit more of a discount. I think that'll help a little bit with the cost. It's hard for me to recommend like a $900 lens and expect anyone to really pick it up, especially if you're an indie filmmaker, but I don't think you'll be disappointed if this is your first foray into anamorphic filmmaking. So thanks for watching. I'm going to leave links for either of these two lenses, not affiliate linked, if you wanted to go buy it now. I'm expecting to make a couple more videos once I recover a little bit more, but thanks for watching.